everybody. Welcome to this webinar, Engaging Partners Through Mutually Reinforcing Activities. This is webinar number 3 in the Collective Impact webinar series focused on engaging underrepresented youth. Engaging Underrepresented Youth, the Collective Impact webinar series, is sponsored by Employment and Social Development Canada, the Learning Branch, and the Tamarack Institute. Let me tell you a little bit about the Tamarack Institute before we dive into the webinar. The Tamarack Institute has two core parts to our work. The first is the Learning Center. And in the Learning Center, we support community change makers like yourselves in 5 interconnected practice areas, which we believe lead to impactful community change. These 5 practice areas include collective impact. This webinar series fits within the collective impact practice area. But we also focus on community engagement, collaborative leadership, community innovation, and evaluating impact. The other half of Tamarack is focused on working with individuals and leaders in communities seeking to drive change in their communities. And we do this through vibrant communities, through Cities Reducing Poverty and Cities Deepening Community, which are networks of citizen leaders in communities across Canada and the United States, seeking to move the needle on those issues. If you want to learn more about Tamarack, visit our website, www.tamarackcommunity.ca. The goals for this webinar are to review the collective impact framework, but to spend some time really focusing in on the third condition of collective impact called mutually reinforcing activities. We'll also introduce you to some tools that will help you map community resources to really maximize mutually reinforcing activities in your community. What is collective impact? Well, collective impact is defined as a disciplined cross-sector approach to solving complex social and environmental issues at scale. This definition was developed by FSG in the Collective Impact Forum. And what they mean by disciplined is that you have to employ the preconditions and the conditions of collective impact in a way that helps drive change on this complex social issue. So the preconditions of the collective impact framework are 3. The first one is influential champions, and it really asks us to identify who those champions are that we want to bring around our leadership table or our collective impact table. So if we're thinking about engaging underrepresented youth, our champions might be underrepresented youth themselves. It could be folks from community and youth serving organizations. It could be business leaders. It could be the educational leaders. So any leaders that would have some impact and some influence over the issue that we're trying to move the needle on. The second precondition is urgency of the issue. And so when we again consider the issue of underrepresented youth, how urgent and important is it in our community? We really have to think about creating some sense of urgency around these issues, because if the issue is urgent, people will want to work with you collaboratively to move the needle on this issue. And then finally, adequate resources. Most collective impact efforts happen over a 3 to 5 year period. And so you want to think about what are the human and financial resources that we need to really be able to get traction on this issue. So those are the 3 preconditions of collective impact. We now move on to the core conditions of collective impact. And there are 5 kind of core conditions of collective impact. The first is a common agenda. And this is where the folks sitting around our table and the folks in the community join us to say, this is the vision that we have for change in our community around this issue of engaging underrepresented youth. And here are some of the core strategies that we're going to put into place to actually move the needle or measure the change, which leads us into the second condition of collective impact, shared measurement. So not only do we have a shared vision for change, but we're also going to measure our results consistently. The third condition of collective impact is mutually reinforcing activities. And this is I often like to say that it's not about new programs and services, but it's about better alignment of existing programs and services. So how do we weave them together in a system that is supported and centered on the issue that we're trying to move forward? The final two conditions of collective impact are continuous communications and backbone support. In this webinar series, we will be dealing with these conditions separately. So there are webinars. Webinar number 1 focuses on common agenda, webinar 2 on shared measurement, and then webinar 4 will focus on continuous communication and backbone support. This webinar, we're going to be focusing on the condition of mutually reinforcing activities. So what do we know about mutually reinforcing activities? Well, we know that it's about aligning existing efforts that exist and resources that exist in our community to really move the needle on our common agenda and our core strategies. And in order for us to do that, we have to get agreement by our partners, our collaborative partners, on the key outcomes that we're trying to move forward. And what's interesting about mutually reinforcing activities is that sometimes certain programs and services can happen on their own, and they're a specialized program and service, or sometimes they can be joined up and complementary, right? So you might have 2 youth serving organizations come together and say, we're going to share the advertising or the communication about this program to the population of youth in our community because it makes more sense to advertise together versus separately. Or we might deliver an after-school program in such a way that, you know, youth come to a single location and they get 2 elements of the program. So that's where we can either have mutually reinforcing activities be specialized, or we can have activities joined up together. The work of mutually reinforcing activities is often described as herding cats. And, you know, this is that might be a little bit of a joke, but it is that, you know, lots of programs and services are used to working on their own and really focusing on their own demographic group. And so mutually reinforcing activities means that they have to come together and they have to have a conversation about, you know, who's delivering what services, how can we get the best outcomes for the folks that are in our community, for the underrepresented youth that we're trying to move the needle for. And so it really is about coordinating these differentiated activities towards achieving the outcomes identified in the common agenda. And lots of practitioners would say that this is really the core essence of the work of collective impact. We also know that mutually reinforcing activities is where we can see the rubber hitting the road, right? It's where people are accessing services and programs in order to get better results and better outcomes for the folks that they're trying to get better outcomes for. And so the benefits should include things like efficiencies, enhanced results, and we know that mutually reinforcing activities, we can orchestrate them in most communities in a way where there needs to be only a minimal funding investment in terms of, because these are programs and services that are already going on in our communities, but they're just not joined up together in a way that helps move the common agenda forward. So what's a strategy for really having conversations about mutually reinforcing activities? And the first one is to, you know, state your common agenda and your shared objectives or your strategies. Then you want to identify, okay, who's doing what in the community and where could some of these activities come together in a more pragmatic kind of way. You then want to fit activities within a larger strategy and then confirm the measures that will show that, that these activities are going to achieve their intended impact. Some strategies to really think about systems change, because collective impact work is really about trying to shift the system, to coordinate the system, to build a better system of support for, in this case, underrepresented youth. So what we see normally that happens in communities is that there's increasing coordination, this kind of aligning of mutually reinforcing activities. Then groups might do some prototyping. They might enhance some of the services and invest in those services that are working well. and that leads then to policy and systems change. So this is really helpful when we think about it in the context of mutually reinforcing activities. Some strategies that you might want to consider in the context of mutually reinforcing activities are there specific policies that you want to work on together, where having multiple partners voice their support for that policy might shift that policy lens. So is that a mutually reinforcing activity? Is there a practice? Might you have certain groups come together and apply for funding collectively to meet the needs of a service or program in your community? Might you have a shared community awareness and voice? Data, the access to and use of data is definitely a strategy around mutually reinforcing activities, because in some cases you might need multiple partners to share their data in order to understand what measures, what success and what progress you're making over time. So these are some mutually reinforcing category areas that you can look into in terms of the work that you're trying to do. Here's an example of a framework for mutually reinforcing activities. It starts with the goal, the 2020 goal. What's the improved outcomes across the indicators that you're achieving? What are the strategies? What are the organizational actions? And that's where the mutually reinforcing activity happens, the aligned organizational actions. And then here are some influential factors at the bottom: the data capacity, the powerful community voice, and the aligned funding approach. So here, the next couple of slides will focus on tools for engaging partners through mutually reinforcing activities. And the first tool, and one of the important first things that you should do when you're leading a collective impact work in your community, is to map your connections. And this really is to identify the projects and activities that you and or your organization or those that are supporting the collective impact initiative are already doing, right? And then really to say, okay, so how do they fit within a variety of different priorities? We've identified some priority areas on this slide, but you might have other ones that you want to identify. And so mapping these connections is really important to consider, how can we leverage who we already know in the community, who we are already connected to really drive change forward, and what would be helpful for us in terms of those connections. Adding your name and email to a post-it note, to the post-it note with the connections, is really quite helpful, because the person, the backbone team that it will be following up on these connections will then be able to know, oh, that's Liz Weaver who has that connection, or maybe she can make the introduction for me. So that's a really important step in the mapping the connections process. Another thing to consider in terms of mutually reinforcing activities is to develop a theory of change. And we would suggest that a theory of change would have these components to it. So what do we want to achieve, for whom, and when? And then how are we going to do that? And if you can be really clear about your theory of change, also known as your common agenda, then, and you can be quite concise about it, you can actually bring people, it can be a great tool to bring people on board, right? And if you think about the separate elements of this theory of change, when you think about what we hope to achieve, you really want to think about the outcomes that you're going to hold yourselves accountable to, for whom. This is looking at the population, the geography, some of those boundaries that we talked about in the Common Agenda webinar, webinar number 1. And then when, in what time frame, is again another boundary. The activities are really identifying the mutually reinforcing activities that you hope to accomplish, or that you hope to be able to leverage in your community as you move forward. So 2 really great tools for thinking about mutually reinforcing activities: mapping your community, and then sharing with your community the theory of change. For more collective impact resources, we invite you to visit www.tamaratcommunity.ca, and we have a special tab on the website for collective impact resources. Please feel free to visit that when you want to. I'm Liz Weaver, and if you want to connect with me, you can email me at liz@tamarackcommunity.ca. Thank you again for listening to webinar number 3 in this webinar series on mutually reinforcing activities. Thank you for joining us on the Engaging Underrepresented Youth Collective Impact webinar series. This webinar is sponsored by Employment and Social Development Canada, the Learning Branch, and by the Tamarack Institute.